At 12:40 a.m., during Aurora Vale's worst blizzard in decades, a retired Navy SEAL opened his cabin door to an elderly couple nearly frozen in the snow. His German shepherd, North, immediately stayed beside the trembling woman as if he sensed a pain no one had spoken about. Hours later, she collapsed with fever and whispered one name again and again: Marlowe. Silas soon learned their wealthy son had taken away her beloved German shepherd and returned home alone. That discovery sent Silas and North into the frozen wilderness, following a fading trail toward an abandoned shed. But when the couple's son finally arrived, Silas realized the missing dog was only part of a much darker family secret. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and please like, comment, and subscribe for more stories of loyalty and second chances. By late afternoon, the sky above northern Minnesota had lost its color. What had begun that morning as an ordinary winter warning had become something altogether different. The storm system moving south from Canada had strengthened without warning, pulling Arctic air behind it and driving snow across Aurora Vale in great white sheets. By 4 o'clock, the county emergency office had advised everyone to stay off the roads. Locals had already given the storm a name: Winter Crown. At the far end of North Lantern Road, where the forest opened briefly toward the frozen expanse of Lake Mirabel, Silas Mercer stepped out of a small generator shed and pulled the door firmly closed behind him. At 55, Silas still carried the unmistakable physical discipline of the Navy SEAL he had once been. He stood 6'1", broad through the shoulders, with the solid build of a man who trained because routine had become part of his bones. His face was angular and distinctly masculine, clean-shaven, with a strong jaw and deep-set blue-gray eyes that seemed darker whenever he was tired. Ash-brown hair, silvering noticeably at the temples, was kept in a neat undercut. Even alone in the wilderness, Silas remained unusually tidy. His long-sleeved green camouflage shirt sat close but comfortably across his frame, matching tactical trousers tucked neatly over dark winter boots. There was nothing ornamental about him. Everything had a purpose. So did the isolation. The cedar cabin overlooking Lake Mirabel had belonged to his grandfather. Silas had visited it as a boy, when the lake meant fishing and mosquito bites rather than silence. After leaving the service, silence had become more useful. No condolences. No questions. No one asking whether he still dreamed about the men he had failed to bring home. Silas checked the generator gauge one last time. Full tank. A yellow and black German shepherd waited beneath the porch roof, watching him through drifting snow. North was 7 years old, large and powerfully built without being bulky. A clear black saddle covered his back over a warm golden coat, while intelligent amber eyes gave him the solemn expression of an animal who seemed perpetually unimpressed by human decisions. His ears stood erect, and a simple dark brown leather collar circled his neck. North had once been trained for search and rescue work. An old ligament injury had ended the professional part of his life, but not the instincts that came with it. Silas nodded toward the dog. Food, heat, generator, we're prepared. North blinked. You could show a little confidence. North turned and walked inside. Silas stared after him. That's hurtful. The joke disappeared into the wind. By 8 that evening, Winter Crown had swallowed North Lantern Road completely. Snow pressed against the windows while pine branches bowed under the weight of ice. Beyond them, Lake Mirabel had vanished into darkness. Silas sat at the kitchen table with a bowl of beef stew and the emergency radio beside him. The latest report was worse. Wind gusts over 50 miles per hour. Road closures spreading west. Temperatures expected to plunge below zero before dawn. Silas glanced toward North, who lay beside the stone fireplace. Looks like we've got ourselves a vacation. One amber eye opened. Snow shoveling tomorrow, snow shoveling the day after that, then for variety, more snow shoveling. North sighed and rested his head back on his paws. Silas almost smiled. Almost. The cabin settled around them with familiar sounds, the ticking wood stove, the low murmur of the generator, wind working against the roof. For most men, such isolation might have felt oppressive. For Silas, it felt controlled. Control had mattered more after the service. There had been a time when men waited for his decisions, a time when seconds mattered, a time when one bad call could become a name engraved in stone. Silas pushed the thought away. He had become very skilled at that. At 12:38 a.m., he turned off the kitchen light. At 12:40, North stood. Silas noticed immediately. The dog had been asleep near the fireplace. Now his head was raised, ears forward. His whole body had gone still. "What?" North looked toward the front door. Silas listened. Nothing. Only wind. North walked toward the entryway. Probably a branch. The German shepherd stopped 3 feet from the door. He did not bark. That bothered Silas more than barking would have. North stared at the wood as if someone were standing on the other side. Silas rose slowly. Then it came. Knock. So faint he almost mistook it for ice striking the siding. A pause. Knock. Silas was already moving. Then, knock. 3 weak knocks. At nearly 1 in the morning. During the worst storm Aurora Vale had seen in decades. No vehicle headlights showed through the window. Silas reached the door but did not open it immediately. His old instincts returned with uncomfortable ease. Position, sound, visibility, unknown number of people. North stood beside him but remained silent. Silas finally opened the door. Snow exploded inward, and beneath the porch light stood 2 people who looked as if winter had nearly finished burying them. The elderly man was tall despite the bend of age in his back. He appeared close to 80, with the lean, durable frame of someone who had spent his life working with his hands. White hair showed beneath a snow-covered wool cap, and a thin silver mustache framed lips that had nearly lost their color. Deep lines ran across a long, weathered face. His large, calloused hands told Silas nearly as much as his clothes did. A tradesman, probably decades of it. Later, Silas would learn his name was Amos Bellamy, 78, a retired carpenter and furniture maker. But that night, Amos was simply a man using what little strength remained to keep his wife upright. The woman beside him was smaller, 74, with a delicate frame nearly swallowed by a navy wool coat. A cream scarf wrapped around her neck, its ends stiff with ice. Silver blonde hair had escaped beneath her knitted hat and clung damply around a gentle, finely lined face. Her name was Clara Bellamy. Even exhausted, there was something graceful about her, something that suggested a woman accustomed to making others comfortable before thinking of herself. At that moment, however, Clara was barely standing. Amos had one arm around her waist. "Please," he managed. "Our car." Silas stepped aside immediately. "Inside." "We don't want to—" "Inside first. Talk later." It was not loud, but it was the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed when circumstances were bad enough. Amos obeyed. Silas shut the door against the storm. Clara's knees buckled almost immediately. Silas caught her before she struck the floor. North backed away to give them room. "Can you hear me, ma'am?" Clara nodded faintly. "My hands." "What about them?" "I can't feel them." Silas's expression tightened. He moved efficiently but without panic. Wet coats came off. Boots followed. He wrapped Clara in 2 dry blankets and settled her near the fireplace, not directly against the heat, but close enough for gradual warming. Amos tried helping. His fingers shook too badly. "Sit down," Silas said. "My wife—" "I've got her." That sentence stopped Amos. Perhaps because Silas said it with absolute certainty. Perhaps because Amos had been carrying responsibility alone for too long. He lowered himself into the chair. For the first time, Silas saw the fear on the old man's face. North had remained near the hallway throughout the commotion. Then something changed. Clara's breathing was becoming steadier. Color was beginning to return to her face. And North walked toward her. Silas looked up sharply. North did not usually approach strangers first. He tolerated people, studied them, waited. But now he crossed the room without hesitation. He stopped beside Clara's chair and sat. Clara noticed him. Her blue eyes rested on the German shepherd. Something in her expression broke. North lowered his head, slowly, carefully, as though offering her a choice. Clara lifted one trembling hand. Her fingertips entered the thick golden fur between his ears, and she began to cry. Not loudly. There was no dramatic sobbing, only tears slipping down an exhausted face while her hand remained on North's head. Amos looked away. Silas did not. "Did he hurt you?" Clara shook her head immediately. "No." Her fingers curled into North's fur. "No, he just—" She stopped. North remained perfectly still. Clara whispered, almost to herself, "I forgot what that felt like." Silas heard it. So did Amos. Neither man asked what she meant. Re-hook. Then North did something Silas had never seen him do with a stranger. The German shepherd shifted closer and gently pressed the side of his muzzle against Clara's wrist. Clara inhaled sharply. Her eyes closed. For one strange second her face was not frightened or exhausted. It was recognition. "Not you," she whispered. North's ears twitched. Clara looked down at him as tears gathered again. "I'm sorry. I thought—" She never completed the sentence. But Silas saw Amos's hand tighten around the edge of his chair. Whatever Clara had mistaken North for, Amos knew exactly what it was. And for the first time that night, Silas understood that the storm outside might not be the reason these two people were afraid. Nearly 40 minutes passed before Silas began asking questions. The Bellamy's old Buick had slipped partly off North Lantern Road. The engine had stalled afterward and refused to restart. They had seen the faint glow of Silas's porch light through the trees. The walk had been a little over half a mile. For Clara, it had almost been too far. "You shouldn't have been driving tonight," Silas said. Amos nodded. "We left before it got this bad." There was no defensiveness in his answer, only exhaustion. "Where were you headed?" "Aurora Vale." "You've got somewhere to stay there?" Amos hesitated. "A friend." Silas noticed the pause but let it pass. He poured warm broth into 2 cups. Clara held hers with both hands. "Is there anyone who needs to know you're safe?" Silas asked. "Family?" Amos stared into the broth. Clara lowered her eyes. Silas watched both of them. "Children?" Clara's fingers tightened suddenly around the cup. A tiny tremor passed through her shoulders. Not cold. Silas knew the difference. Amos spoke before she could. "One son." Silas waited. The fire cracked softly. "And does he know you're out here?" Amos's jaw moved. "No." "Should we contact him?" Clara's head came up. "No." The word was immediate. Too immediate. Then she seemed embarrassed by its force. "I mean—" She looked toward Amos. He placed one weathered hand gently over hers. "We'll handle that in the morning." Silas studied them. Years of military work had taught him that fear rarely announced itself cleanly. Sometimes it looked like anger, sometimes silence, sometimes an elderly woman trembling at the mention of her own child. Silas nodded. "All right." He did not press, but he no longer believed their trouble had started when the Buick left the road. Silas gave the Bellamys the small guest room and took the sofa himself. At 2:57 a.m., something touched his hand. His eyes opened instantly. North stood beside the couch. The dog's posture was alert, not frightened, urgent. Silas sat up. "What is it?" North turned toward the guest room. Silas followed. He heard Clara before reaching the doorway. Her breathing was shallow and uneven. Amos sat beside the bed, frightened. She woke up shaking. Silas crossed the room. Clara's skin was hot now. Too hot. The cold had hidden something earlier. A fever. Her breathing had become labored, and her eyes moved beneath half-closed lids. Silas checked her pulse. "Clara?" She murmured something. He leaned closer. "Marlowe." Amos froze. Silas looked at him. Clara's hand moved weakly over the blanket, searching for something that wasn't there. "Marlowe." North stood in the doorway. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Silas looked from the feverish woman to Amos. The old man's face had changed. The weariness remained, but beneath it was guilt. Deep, unmistakable guilt. Silas turned toward North. The German shepherd's amber eyes remained fixed on Clara. And in the silence of that snowbound cabin, one unfamiliar name seemed suddenly heavier than the storm outside. Marlowe. Morning did not arrive so much as reveal itself. The windows of Silas Mercer's cabin had turned pale with frost, and beyond them, Winter Crown still moved across Aurora Vale in long white curtains. The storm had weakened slightly from its midnight fury, but the roads remained buried, the phone signal flickered in and out, and the emergency radio repeated the same warning every 15 minutes. Travel only if absolutely necessary. Silas had been awake since before dawn. Clara Bellamy remained in the guest room, bundled beneath blankets, her breathing less ragged than it had been during the night, but still too shallow for his liking. Amos sat beside her, one hand resting near her shoulder without touching it, as if afraid even comfort might disturb her. Silas moved quietly through the cabin, checking the wood stove, warming water, and measuring time by small tasks. That was how he had survived difficult years. Do the next thing, then the next. Do not think farther than necessary. North seemed to understand the rhythm. The 7-year-old German shepherd lay just outside the guest room door, his yellow and black coat catching the firelight whenever he lifted his head. His amber eyes followed every movement inside the room. He did not crowd Clara. He simply remained there, alert and silent. At 7:16 a.m., Silas finally managed to raise someone on the emergency radio. North Lantern Station, this is Mercer at Lake Mirabel. I've got a 74-year-old female, recent cold exposure, fever, respiratory difficulty, history of cardiac surgery. Static answered. Then a man's voice pushed through. Mercer, this is Rourke. I copy you. Silas recognized the voice immediately. Caleb Rourke, 51, ran Aurora Vale's volunteer rescue team. I was a broad, heavy-built man with short salt-and-pepper hair, a square face weathered by years of winter calls, and a close-trimmed beard that made him look sterner than he actually was. Caleb had spent much of his adult life as a firefighter before an injured shoulder pushed him into emergency coordination. He was practical, dryly funny, and possessed the irritating habit of treating Silas like a neighbor, even when Silas had spent years making it clear he did not want to be treated like one. You still collecting emergencies instead of joining my team? Caleb asked through the static. Not the time. That means yes. Silas ignored him. I need medical guidance. Hold. A minute later, another voice came through. Female, calm, precise. Mr. Mercer, this is Dr. Naomi Sutter. Silas straightened slightly. Doctor. Naomi Sutter, 45, was Aurora Vale's family physician and the nearest doctor within practical reach that morning. She was a lean woman of medium height with light brown hair, usually tied low at the back of her neck, an angular face softened by thoughtful gray-green eyes, and the kind of composed voice that made people stop panicking because she refused to join them. Years of working in a remote northern town had taught Naomi to distrust drama and respect preparation. She began asking questions: temperature, pulse, skin color, level of consciousness, cough, chest pain. Silas answered each one. His old combat medicine training returned automatically. It had been years since he had worked under fire, but the habits were still clean. Naomi paused after hearing the full picture. She may have been developing a respiratory infection before the exposure. The cold and exhaustion likely pushed her harder than she could tolerate. Her cardiac history complicates it. Can she stay here? For now, yes. Keep her warm gradually, keep her hydrated in small amounts, and monitor her breathing. If she develops chest pain, confusion, blue lips, or loses consciousness, I want to know immediately. Silas looked toward the room. What are the chances you can get here? Another pause. Caleb says there may be a weather window late morning. Caleb cut back in. I can bring the tracked rescue vehicle up North Lantern if the drifts don't close again. Silas glanced outside. The pine trees were nearly erased by blowing snow. Don't push it. Caleb laughed once. Coming from a former SEAL who lives 10 miles from everybody, that is excellent advice. The transmission crackled, then ended. Clara slept through most of the morning. Amos did not. He moved between the guest room and the front window with the restless guilt of a man who believed sitting still was a form of failure. Silas watched him for a while before setting a mug of coffee on the table. Drink. Amos looked at it. I'm fine. No, you're 78. You walked half a mile through a blizzard, and you've been awake all night. Amos raised an eyebrow. You always this charming? Only with guests. For the first time, the older man almost smiled. He sat. In daylight, Silas could see more clearly what the night had hidden. Amos had once been a strong man. The evidence remained in the width of his hands, the thickness of his wrists, and the straightness he still tried to maintain despite arthritis pulling his shoulders forward. His faded brown flannel coat hung drying near the stove, leaving him in a dark wool sweater worn shiny at the elbows. His hands were carpenter's hands, large, scarred, careful. Silas knew hands like that. Men who built things often carried themselves differently from men who only owned them. They measured before they cut. They understood that mistakes became permanent if ignored long enough. Silas slid the coffee closer. Amos finally took it. For several minutes, neither spoke. Silas did not ask about the name Clara had called during the night. He did not ask about their son. Pressure made frightened people defend the very thing hurting them. Silence sometimes gave them room to stop. Eventually, Amos spoke. "My wife had heart surgery 3 years ago." Silas looked at him but said nothing. Amos stared at the steam rising from his cup. "It was worse than we expected. Recovery took months." His voice was quiet. "Our son helped us through most of it." That surprised Silas, not because he had already decided the son was cruel, because Amos sounded grateful. "His name is Preston." Amos rubbed one thumb along the rim of the mug. "Preston Bellamy, 48, real estate development, Minneapolis." He gave a tired, humorless smile. "Very successful, if you measure a man by buildings." Rehook North suddenly lifted his head from the hallway, not toward the door, toward Amos. The dog stood and crossed the room, stopping beside the old man's chair. Amos looked down. North did not nudge him, did not ask for attention. He simply placed one paw lightly across Amos's boot. Amos went completely still. Silas watched the old man's face. Something almost childlike passed through it. Grief, perhaps, or permission. Amos slowly lowered one scarred hand onto North's neck. Then he whispered, "He used to do that too." Silas said nothing. North remained there, and Amos finally began telling the truth. After Clara's surgery, Preston had stepped in quickly. He paid several medical bills Amos and Clara had struggled with. He organized appointments. He arranged grocery deliveries. When Clara became anxious about being alone, Preston convinced them to leave Aurora Vale and move into a guest house on his property outside Minneapolis. "At first," Amos said, "I thought we were lucky." He looked ashamed of the admission. Silas shook his head. "You were being helped. For a while." That was the distinction. At first, Preston handled bills because Clara was recovering. Then he began handling bank accounts because, he said, it was easier. He took Amos's car keys after one minor parking lot scrape. He began rescheduling medical appointments without asking. He corrected Clara whenever she invited old friends to visit. Every decision came packaged in concern. Amos's mouth tightened. He always said the same thing. Silas waited. "I'm only helping." There was no anger in the phrase anymore, only exhaustion. Silas had seen control disguised as protection before. In teams, in marriages, in families. Sometimes the hardest cages to recognize were built from reasonable explanations. Amos continued. "Then there was Marlowe. Marlowe's a German shepherd," he said. The name now had a body, a history, a place in the room. Marlowe is 10 years old, yellow and black, big black saddle across the back, gray around the muzzle now. Amos's face changed while describing him, softer. "He came to us as a pup, awkward thing, feet too big for the rest of him, couldn't cross a kitchen floor without crashing into something." Silas almost smiled. "Sounds familiar." North looked mildly offended. Amos actually chuckled. It lasted only a second. Marlowe became Clara's shadow. During the difficult months after surgery, Clara had struggled with anxiety at night. Sometimes she woke convinced her heart was failing again. Amos could calm her eventually, but Marlowe often noticed first. The old dog would rise from his bed, walk to her side, and rest his head against the mattress until she slowed her breathing. He never needed a command, Amos said. He just knew. Silas looked toward North. He understood why Clara had reacted the way she had. Preston, however, had grown increasingly irritated by the dog. Hair on furniture, mud near the entrance, barking when strangers entered. Mostly, Amos believed, Preston disliked how deeply Clara depended on Marlowe. He said the dog was making her weak. Silas's eyes hardened. Amos saw it. He said if she kept leaning on the dog every time she was frightened, she'd never learn to manage without him. Silas leaned back slightly. And what did Clara say? She said Marlowe wasn't medicine. Amos smiled faintly. She said he was family. That answer had not helped. Late in the morning, the storm briefly loosened its grip. A low engine growled somewhere beyond the trees. Silas stepped onto the porch and saw an orange-tracked rescue vehicle crawling through the snow. Caleb drove. Naomi sat beside him. When Naomi entered the cabin, she removed her olive winter parka, revealing a dark turtleneck and practical clothes beneath. She wasted no time on introductions beyond what was necessary. Her focus went directly to Clara. She examined her lungs, checked oxygen saturation, listened to her heart, and reviewed the medications Amos had brought in a small plastic case. After 20 minutes, Naomi emerged. She's stable. Amos released a breath. But she should not be moved today unless something changes, Naomi added. The exposure aggravated an infection she already had. She needs rest, fluids, antibiotics, and observation. Silas nodded. Naomi looked at him. You're comfortable monitoring her? Yes. I know. The answer made him glance at her. She added quietly, Caleb talks. From the doorway, Caleb said, Only complimentary things. Silas gave him a look. Caleb grinned. Naomi left medication instructions and promised to stay reachable by radio. Before leaving, she crouched briefly beside North. The German shepherd allowed one polite scratch behind the ear, then immediately looked back toward Clara's room. Naomi noticed. Dedicated nurse. Unlicensed, Silas said. Most reliable kind. Then she and Caleb disappeared back into the white road. By early afternoon, Clara's fever had eased slightly. She slept. Amos continued. The day before he and Clara left Preston's property, Preston had announced he was taking Marlowe to a pet care facility. He had said the arrangement was temporary. Clara argued, Amos said. I argued too. But Preston had already made the decision. He loaded Marlowe into the SUV. Hours later, he returned alone. Clara asked where the dog was. Preston told her not to worry about it. Then eventually, he said the sentence Amos had not been able to forget. You don't need him anymore. Silas's jaw tightened. Which facility? That's the problem. Amos had called every shelter and veterinary clinic he could find within driving distance. No Marlowe Bellamy. No 10-year-old German shepherd matching the description. Nothing. When I asked Preston again, he got angry. Amos looked at his hands. He reminded us who had paid the hospital debt, who gave us a place to live, who managed the money. Silas felt something cold settle beneath his ribs. Not rage exactly. Rage was hot. This was cleaner, more dangerous. Judgment. What happened next? I packed. Amos said it simply. He had called an old friend in Aurora Vale, June Holloway, and planned to ask whether she could let them stay for a few days. He and Clara left before Winter Crown had been upgraded to a major emergency. They thought they could beat the weather north. They were wrong. The roads got bad fast, Amos said, then worse. By the time they reached Lake Mirabel, the Buick was fighting drifts. Then it slid. Then the engine died. Then came the porch light through the trees. Silas absorbed all of it. Finally he asked, Does Preston know you left? I imagine he does by now. And does he know where you are? No. Amos looked at him. And I'd like to keep it that way for the moment. Silas nodded. Near sunset, Clara woke. Silas was carrying a bowl of broth into the room when North entered behind him. Clara looked toward the doorway. Her tired face brightened, only for an instant. Marlowe. The word came with such relief that Silas stopped. Then Clara blinked. Recognition settled correctly. Her smile vanished. Oh. North approached slowly and sat beside the bed. Clara reached down and touched his head. This time she knew exactly who he was. I'm sorry, North. The dog leaned gently into her hand. Clara looked at Silas. He has the same patience. Silas placed the broth on the nightstand. As Marlowe? She nodded. Her eyes filled but did not overflow. "I keep thinking I hear him." Silas sat back slightly. He had spent years believing grief was mostly about absence. Standing there, he realized it could be the opposite. Sometimes grief was presence everywhere, in footsteps that were not there, in an empty space beside a bed, in the shape of another dog's head beneath a familiar hand. Silas looked at Amos, then at North, then back at Clara. Finding Marlowe would not repair everything Preston had done. It would not erase the control or humiliation. It would not restore 3 lost years. But perhaps that was not the point. Perhaps some things did not need to fix the whole wound. Perhaps they only needed to return one piece of a person that should never have been taken. And Silas knew, before he said a word, that he was no longer thinking of Marlowe as somebody else's missing dog. He was thinking of him as someone who needed to be found. 2 days after Winter Crown struck Aurora Vale, the storm finally began to loosen its grip. The change was almost violent in its beauty. The sky opened into a hard northern blue, clean and cold enough to seem polished. Sunlight poured over the fresh snow and turned every roof, fence post, and pine branch into something painfully bright. Lake Mirabel lay frozen beneath the morning light, a broad white silence stretching beyond the trees. Inside Silas Mercer's cabin, Clara Bellamy was improving, but slowly. Dr. Naomi Sutter had returned that morning to check her lungs and heart. The fever had eased, and Clara's oxygen level was better, yet she still ate only a few spoonfuls at a time and slept in short, restless stretches. "She's medically moving in the right direction," Naomi told Silas quietly near the kitchen counter. "But exhaustion is only part of this." Silas knew what she meant. Clara was recovering physically. Something inside her was still waiting. After Naomi left, Amos sat near the window with a legal pad on his knee. Silas placed a pencil beside it. "We start with facts." Amos looked at him. "You sound like you're planning a raid." "I'm planning not to waste time." That earned a faint smile. Silas pulled out the chair across from him. "Everything you remember about the day Marlowe disappeared." Amos closed his eyes for a moment. "Preston left around 3. "How sure?" "Clara had a cardiology call at 2:30. He waited until afterward." Silas wrote it down. "When did he come back?" "Close to 6. "Vehicle?" "His SUV." "Anything unusual?" Amos hesitated. Then his eyes narrowed. "The tires." Silas stopped writing. "What about them?" "Red dirt. Mud, maybe. Along the lower doors, too." That mattered. The roads around Preston's Minneapolis property had been frozen solid that week. No thaw, no rain, no reason for fresh red mud. Silas leaned back. Northern Minnesota had plenty of forest roads where iron-rich soil stained tires a rusty red beneath packed snow. Not proof, but something. What else? Amos thought harder. He changed his boots when he came inside. Why do you remember that? Because Preston never changes shoes in the mudroom. He thinks the housekeeper should handle whatever he tracks in. Silas looked up. That detail said more about Preston than Amos probably intended. By late morning, Silas was on the phone with the county sheriff's office. He did not call pretending he already knew what had happened. He called because a 10-year-old dog was missing under suspicious circumstances, and the owners wanted help locating him. The deputy who arrived at the cabin just after noon introduced herself as Mara Venn. She was 38, medium tall and athletic, with dark brown hair pulled into a low practical knot beneath a winter patrol cap. Her face was narrow and composed, with high cheekbones, a straight nose, and watchful hazel eyes that seemed to settle on details before people. She wore the county's winter uniform beneath a dark insulated patrol jacket and moved with the economical confidence of someone accustomed to arriving after other people had already made a situation emotional. Mara had grown up 2 counties east and joined law enforcement after her younger brother was nearly killed by a drunk driver. The experience had made her patient with frightened people and deeply intolerant of conclusions unsupported by evidence. She listened to Amos without interrupting. Then she turned to Silas. "You're helping them search?" "Yes." "You're not investigating Preston." Silas held her gaze. "I know the difference." "Good." Mara's expression barely changed. "Because finding a missing dog and proving someone committed a crime are not the same job." Silas nodded once. That seemed to satisfy her. Amos produced Marlowe's veterinary records, photographs, microchip information, and a handwritten authorization confirming that Silas could assist in searching for the dog. Mara photographed everything. Then she began checking what she legally could: traffic cameras, public roadway footage, calls to nearby businesses. Not because red mud proved anything, because time, direction, and vehicle movement could begin to form a pattern. Silas waited. He had spent years learning that impatience rarely improved intelligence. North was less philosophical. The German shepherd paced between the porch door and Amos's chair until Silas finally told him to lie down. North obeyed, reluctantly. The first useful call came just before 2. Mara stepped outside for privacy, then returned 10 minutes later. A county traffic camera caught a dark luxury SUV matching Preston's make and model on Highway 61 northbound that afternoon. Amos stared at her. "How far north?" "Far enough that we keep looking." Mara raised one hand before hope could outrun evidence. "It does not prove Marlowe was in the vehicle." Silas appreciated that. "What's next?" "Gas stations along the route." The answer arrived faster than expected. A clerk at a service station near Red Willow Junction remembered a man in an expensive dark SUV because he had purchased 2 cans of premium fuel, bottled water, and several tins of dog food. Mara spoke to him twice. The second time, she asked him to describe the driver without giving Preston's appearance first. The description was close enough to matter. The clerk also remembered the SUV continuing west, toward Red Willow Forestry Road. Silas unfolded a regional map across the kitchen table. Red Willow ran through miles of state forest, seasonal camps, maintenance access roads, and old recreation areas that were mostly empty in winter. Amos stared at the map. If Preston left him somewhere out there. He did not finish. Silas did not offer false reassurance. A 10-year-old German shepherd could survive cold longer than many breeds if he found shelter and remained dry. But every day mattered. Rehook North, who had been lying beneath the table, suddenly rose. No command, no sound outside. He walked directly to Clara's travel bag near the hallway and pressed his nose against the zipper. Silas frowned. Amos slowly stood. "What's in there?" "Mostly clothes." Amos opened the bag. North ignored the folded sweaters. He pushed deeper with his nose until Amos pulled out an old wool blanket, small enough for a dog bed. Clara had packed it without telling anyone. Amos stared at it. Marlowe slept on this. North inhaled slowly along one corner. Then his posture changed. His head lifted. His body became still, not excited, focused. Silas recognized it instantly. Working behavior. For the first time, the search stopped being only maps, cameras, and other people's memories. Now North had a scent. Silas knelt beside him. "You know what you're looking for?" North looked toward the door. Silas almost smiled. "Yeah, thought so." They did not attempt to make North track a scent from Minneapolis. That would have been nonsense. Instead, the blanket gave him Marlowe's scent profile. The search itself would begin only after they reached the area supported by the vehicle evidence. Caleb Rourke joined them with the tracked rescue vehicle, spare fuel, thermal blankets, first aid supplies, and enough food for a full day outside. "You always pack like this?" Amos asked. Caleb shrugged. "I've met weather before." Mara stayed behind to continue verifying the roadway information and coordinate with forestry personnel. Silas, Caleb, and North headed toward Red Willow. The trip took more than an hour. Snowbanks rose shoulder-high in places. By the time they reached the forestry access point, the sun had begun to slide west. Red Willow looked beautiful from a distance. Up close, it felt enormous. Pines crowded both sides of the road. Old snowmobile trails disappeared beneath fresh drifts. Seasonal cabins stood dark behind locked gates. Silas clipped a long working lead to North's collar. He let the dog smell Marlowe's blanket again. Find. North lowered his nose. At first, nothing. He moved in a widening pattern around the parking turnout, checking tire ruts, brush, and the edges of snowbanks. Caleb followed 20 feet back. Silas watched the dog more than the ground. Search dogs did not point like machines. They changed. Speed, breathing, tail, head position. North wandered near a buried picnic table and stopped. He dug. Silas crouched and brushed away snow. A cheap plastic dog bowl appeared beneath the crust. Blue, cracked along one side. Amos had described Marlowe's home bowl as stainless steel, so this one proved nothing. But it proved a dog had been there recently enough for the bowl not to be completely buried by older snow. They moved deeper into the recreation area. Near an abandoned summer shelter, North became interested in one wooden post. Silas examined it. 4 shallow scratches ran down the lower section. Dog claws. Caleb looked around. Could be anybody's. Could. Silas photographed them anyway. They continued. The sun lowered. The temperature followed. Nearly an hour later, North suddenly pulled left toward an old livestock fence bordering a disused service track. Easy. North stopped. He sniffed one fence post, then another. Silas saw something caught beneath a loop of wire, a strip of dark material. He knelt. At first he thought it was fabric. Then he saw stitching, collar webbing. His pulse changed. Silas carefully freed the torn piece. Something metallic dropped into the snow. He dug with gloved fingers. A small identification tag surfaced. Caleb leaned closer. Silas wiped ice away with his thumb. The engraved letters appeared one line at a time. Marlowe Bellamy. For several seconds the forest seemed to go completely silent. Caleb removed his cap. Hell. Silas turned the tag over. Clara's phone number was engraved on the back. No guesswork now. Marlowe had been here. North stood beside the fence, nose lifted toward the trees beyond it. Silas looked west. The forest stretched into shadow. They could not safely push deep into unfamiliar terrain with darkness approaching. But the search had changed. They were no longer looking for a possibility. They were following a trail. Silas radioed Mara first. She logged the location and told them not to disturb anything else around the fence until forestry staff could document the immediate area. Then Silas called the cabin. Amos answered. Silas? We found something. Silence. Then Clara's voice, weak in the background. Did you find him? Silas closed his eyes briefly. He could have lied kindly. He could have given hope a shape it had not earned yet. He refused. We found Marlowe's collar tag. The other end went quiet. Clara did not cry. That somehow made it harder. Silas looked at North. The German shepherd was no longer paying attention to him. North stood facing deeper into the red willow woods, nose raised into the cold evening air. His ears tilted forward. His entire body seemed drawn toward something beyond the fence. Silas tightened his grip on the radio. We don't have Marlowe yet. A pause. But North still has interest in the trail. Clara finally spoke. Then please don't give up. Silas looked at the forest. The light was fading. The cold was deepening. And somewhere beyond those trees, one old dog had left behind the first undeniable proof that he had survived long enough to reach Red Willow. Silas answered quietly, We won't. The temperature began falling before the sun reached the western tree line. Cold in northern Minnesota had layers. There was the ordinary cold that reddened cheeks and stiffened fingers, and then there was the deeper kind, the kind that seemed to empty the forest of sound and turn every careless decision into a debt that eventually had to be paid. Silas Mercer checked his watch. 4:41 p.m. The last clean light would not hold much longer. Caleb Rourke stood beside the tracked rescue vehicle, brushing ice from his beard with one gloved hand. The identification tag they had recovered had already been photographed and its location documented. Forestry personnel would examine the immediate area when daylight returned. Caleb looked toward the darkening trees. We stop here. Silas did not argue. That surprised Caleb enough to make him glance over. You feeling all right? Getting old. You're 55. Exactly. Caleb snorted. Years earlier, Silas might have continued simply because stopping felt too much like surrender. Experience had eventually taught him the difference between courage and stupidity. Night temperatures were expected to plunge dangerously low. A missing dog did not need 3 more missing people searching for him. Silas turned toward North. Come on. The German shepherd did not move. North stood 30 yards away near the edge of an abandoned seasonal maintenance area. His yellow and black coat was dusted with snow, ears erect, nose angled into the wind. North. One ear turned toward Silas. The rest of the dog remained pointed east. Caleb folded his arms. "I believe you've been ignored. Temporary hearing problem." Silas walked over. North moved several yards toward him, then stopped, turned around, and went back. Silas narrowed his eyes. That was not disobedience. North had been trained too well for meaningless stubbornness. Silas crouched. "What do you have?" North lowered his nose. He moved in a short arc through the snow, raised his head into the crosswind, then returned to almost the exact same spot. Once, twice, 3 times. Silas watched the pattern carefully. North was not following a clean ground trail. He was trying to locate something carried intermittently on the air. Caleb joined him. "Scent? Maybe. Strong enough?" "No." Silas watched North again. "But strong enough that he doesn't want to leave." They had perhaps 20 minutes before continuing would become irresponsible. Silas made the decision. 1 controlled sweep. Caleb nodded. 20 minutes. 15. Caleb smiled. That really is age. They began a systematic search around the abandoned maintenance area. An old picnic shelter stood half buried near the road. Beyond it were a storage rack, a collapsed woodshed, and 2 structures shown on the forestry map as seasonal maintenance buildings. North checked each one. Nothing. At the second building, he lingered around the downwind wall before moving on. Silas followed without rushing him. Search dogs did not perform miracles. Wind shifted scent. Snow trapped it. Buildings created eddies that could carry odor in misleading directions. North's job was not to know the answer. His job was to provide information. Silas's job was to interpret it without forcing the answer he wanted. They descended toward a narrow creek frozen beneath several inches of snow. The forest grew denser. Caleb checked his watch. 7 minutes. Silas nodded. North stopped. His ears moved forward, then he turned sharply uphill, not toward the road, toward a small rise crowded by young spruce. He climbed it faster than he had moved all afternoon. North. The dog disappeared behind the trees. Silas followed. On the other side sat a structure almost invisible beneath accumulated snow, a small maintenance shed. The roof sagged slightly under the weight of winter. Its brown wooden siding blended into the trunks around it, and a drift had piled nearly halfway up the front door. North reached the structure. He sniffed along the lower wall, then around the doorframe. His breathing changed, shorter, faster, focused. Silas felt his own pulse rise. Caleb saw it too. "This is different." "Yes." North pawed once at the packed snow beneath the door. Silas crouched. There were marks in the wood, not fresh enough to know when they had been made, but unmistakable. Scratches, 4 parallel lines, then several more beneath them. Something had tried to get through that door, or out of it. Rehook. Silas reached for North's collar to move him aside. North suddenly froze. Every muscle in the German shepherd's body became still. His head tilted. Silas heard nothing. "North?" The dog lowered his muzzle toward the narrow gap beneath the door. Then, from somewhere inside the shed, came a sound so faint Silas nearly blamed the wind. A single scrape. Silence. Then another. North lay down immediately in the snow, nose pressed toward the gap. He did not bark. He did not claw. He simply waited. Caleb's expression changed. "There's something alive in there." Silas was already reaching for the folding shovel strapped to his pack. They cleared the doorway carefully. The packed snow had hardened into dense layers near the threshold. Beneath that, ice had sealed the lower hinge. Caleb worked the shovel while Silas used a short pry bar. "Easy," Silas said. "If something's against the door—" "I know." After several minutes, the wood shifted an inch. North stood. Silas widened the opening gradually. Cold, stale air escaped from inside. Then came a smell. Old fabric. Damp wood. Dog. Silas's chest tightened. He opened the door just far enough to enter sideways. The inside was nearly dark. A small window had been covered by frost. Shelves lined one wall. Rusted tools hung from hooks, and several burlap insulation sacks had fallen from a stack in the corner. Something lay among them. Silas stopped. A German shepherd. Older, thin, motionless except for shallow breathing. Marlowe. The dog's eyes opened. He was 10 years old, large-framed beneath the weight he had lost, with a black saddle spread across a faded golden coat. Gray had begun to whiten the fur around his muzzle, emphasizing dark brown eyes that looked exhausted but alert. His ears remained recognizably upright, though one drooped slightly with fatigue. He tried to lift his head. It fell back. "Easy, boy." Silas crouched rather than approaching directly. Marlowe was weak, frightened, and possibly injured. Even a gentle dog could bite under those conditions. North entered behind Silas. "Stay." North stopped. The two German shepherds looked at one another. Nothing dramatic happened. No barking, no rush of recognition. North simply lowered himself onto the floor several feet away. Marlowe stared at him. For perhaps 10 seconds the older dog did nothing. Then his tail moved. Once. A faint sweep against a burlap sack. Caleb exhaled behind Silas. "Well," he swallowed before adding quietly, "looks like the second doctor finally showed up." Silas smiled despite himself. They assessed Marlowe before moving him. No major bleeding, no obvious fracture. His paws were irritated and raw in several places from prolonged exposure, but not catastrophically damaged. He was dehydrated and badly depleted. The shed had likely saved his life. Its walls blocked the wind, while fallen insulation sacks and old burlap kept him off the frozen floor. There was also evidence that rodents had gotten into a torn bag of maintenance worker snacks stored high on a shelf. Not enough food, but perhaps enough to matter. Silas offered small amounts of water rather than letting Marlowe drink too quickly. The older dog accepted. Only then did Silas allow himself to believe they might truly take him home alive. They wrapped Marlowe in thermal blankets and transported him carefully to the rescue vehicle. North remained beside him. During the ride, the two dogs touched noses once, nothing more. Some bonds did not need introductions. Dr. Naomi Sutter met them at Aurora Vale's small clinic. Under the bright examination lights, Marlowe looked older than he had in the shed. Naomi checked his temperature, pause, hydration, heart rate, joints, and abdomen. "He's fortunate," she finally said. Silas looked at her. "How fortunate?" "Dehydrated, underfed, mild cold injury to the pads, exhausted, but I don't see anything suggesting severe frostbite or major trauma." Caleb let out a slow breath. Naomi pointed at Silas. "That is not permission for heroic optimism. He needs controlled food, fluids, warmth, and rest." "I know. I enjoy saying it anyway." North sat outside the examination room, staring through the glass. Naomi noticed. "You can tell his colleague the patient is stable." Silas looked at North. "He doesn't trust my medical updates." Smart dog. By the time they reached Lake Mirabel, evening had settled completely. Silas entered first. Amos was beside the fireplace. Clara sat in the old armchair, wrapped in a blanket. Her face was still pale from illness, but more alert than Silas had seen it since her arrival. She looked toward him. Silas stepped aside. Caleb entered, carrying one end of the padded transport sling. Marlowe's paws touched the wooden floor. The sound was soft. 4 uneven taps. Clara's head turned. She did not breathe for a moment. Then she began to stand. Too quickly. Amos caught her arm. "Easy." Clara stared toward the hallway. "Marlowe?" The old German shepherd raised his head. Clara covered her mouth. Marlowe took one step, then another. His gait was stiff and tired, but he continued until he reached her. Clara sank carefully to her knees. Her hands found the gray fur around his face. Marlowe pressed his head against her chest. No one spoke. Amos turned toward the window and wiped his eyes with the heel of one hand. Caleb studied the ceiling as though it had suddenly become fascinating. Silas remained near the door. North came to stand beside him. For once, Silas did not feel like an outsider watching somebody else's family. He felt like a witness to something that had almost been stolen forever. That night, Clara ate nearly the entire bowl Naomi had approved for dinner. Marlowe slept beside her chair. North rested nearby. Hours passed without Clara waking in panic. When Naomi checked by radio later, Silas told her Clara had eaten and was finally sleeping deeply. Naomi was quiet for a moment. The antibiotics are working, her fever is improving, warmth and rest are doing their part. Silas looked across the room. Clara slept beneath a blanket. One hand hung over the side of the chair. Her fingers rested lightly against Marlowe's old gray muzzle. Naomi continued, "But sometimes patients need a reason to cooperate with getting better." Silas smiled faintly. "Medical terminology?" "Absolutely." A pause. "Unfortunately, I can't prescribe that particular medicine." Silas ended the call and looked toward the two German shepherds, one young enough to keep searching, one old enough to have survived being lost. North opened his eyes. Silas gave him a small nod. "You did good." North's tail struck the floor once. Then the cabin became quiet again. Not the empty silence Silas had once preferred. Something warmer, something alive. By the third morning after Marlowe's return, the cabin at Lake Mirabel no longer felt temporary. Clara's medicine sat beside the kettle. Amos had begun leaving his reading glasses on the corner of Silas's kitchen table. Marlowe slept on a folded blanket near the fireplace, while North occupied the space between him and the front door as though some private agreement had been reached between the two German shepherds. Outside, the sky was bright again. Winter Crown had passed east, leaving Aurora Vale buried beneath clean white snow and a silence so clear that distant engines could be heard long before they appeared. That was how Silas heard the vehicle. A smooth, expensive engine. Not Caleb's tracked rescue rig, not Naomi's small utility vehicle. Something quieter. He stood at the window. A black luxury SUV came slowly down North Lantern Road. Silas did not need Amos to tell him who was driving. Amos had been carrying a mug toward Clara. He stopped before reaching her. The color left his face. Clara saw it. "What is it?" Amos did not answer. Marlowe raised his head. North was already standing. The SUV stopped near the porch. A man stepped out. Preston Bellamy was 48 years old, tall and well-proportioned, with the carefully maintained build of a man who paid for a private gym and disliked appearing careless in any part of his life. His dark brown hair was neatly cut and combed away from a sharp forehead. He was clean-shaven, with a strong chin, straight nose, and handsome features that would have photographed well in a business magazine. There was nothing visibly threatening about him. That was the first thing Silas noticed. Preston wore a charcoal wool overcoat over a dark turtleneck, tailored trousers, and polished leather winter boots that looked expensive enough to resent the snow. In one hand he carried a small suitcase, in the other, a pharmacy bag. He looked like a responsible son arriving to rescue elderly parents from a misunderstanding. Silas understood immediately why men like Preston were difficult to explain. Cruelty rarely introduced itself by shouting. Sometimes it arrived with medication neatly labeled. Preston walked toward the porch. Silas opened the door before he knocked. "Silas Mercer?" His voice was measured, professional. "Yes. I'm Preston Bellamy." "I know." Preston's eyes moved past Silas into the cabin. He saw Amos first, then Clara. His shoulders loosened with what looked almost like genuine relief. "Mom." Clara's hand tightened around the blanket over her knees. Preston stepped forward. Silas did not block him. "Not yet." "I've been looking everywhere for you." Amos's mouth hardened. "We left a message." "A message saying you were going north." "Nothing else." Preston placed the suitcase near the wall. "I brought Mom's clothes, her medications too. Some of those prescriptions need to be taken on schedule." Silas glanced at the pharmacy bag. The labels appeared legitimate. That mattered. Preston was not pretending to care. That was what made him more complicated. He probably did care. He simply believed caring entitled him to control. Clara remained seated. Marlowe slowly stood beside her chair. He was still recovering, his older yellow and black frame thinner than it should have been, gray fur visible along the muzzle. His paws were healing and his movements remained careful. Preston saw him. Everything in his face changed for less than a second. Shock. Then calculation. Then nothing. Silas caught all three. "Marlowe," Preston said. Clara looked up. "You sound surprised." Preston recovered quickly. I am. I thought he was gone. Marlowe did not approach him. North moved closer to Clara, not aggressively, but deliberately. The younger German shepherd stood between the chair and the open part of the room. Preston noticed. "So that's your dog?" "North," Silas said. "He trained?" "Yes." "For protection?" "Search and rescue." Preston nodded as if filing away information. Then he turned back to his parents. "We need to go." Amos stared at him. "No." Preston's expression remained patient. "Dad, you drove Mom into a historic winter storm. We left before it became one. That doesn't make it responsible." Amos's jaw tightened. Preston continued. "Mom has cardiac issues. She became sick enough to need a doctor. You ended up at a stranger's cabin in the woods." Silas watched Clara. She was not looking at her son. She was looking at the floor. Preston's tone softened. "Mom, come home." Clara's breathing changed. North noticed before Silas did. His head turned toward her. Marlowe moved closer to her knee. The two dogs did not bark. They simply occupied space. Silas had seen security teams do the same thing. No threat, just presence. "Clara," Silas said calmly. She looked at him. "Do you want to leave with Preston?" Preston answered first. "She's exhausted." Silas did not look at him. "I asked Clara." The room became still. Clara swallowed. Then she said, "No." Not loudly, but clearly. Preston blinked. "Mom, no." The second one was stronger. Rehook Marlowe suddenly moved, not toward Preston, toward Clara. The old German shepherd carefully pushed his muzzle beneath her trembling hand. At the same time, North crossed behind her chair and sat on the opposite side. One old dog, one younger dog, Clara between them. For a strange, quiet moment, the arrangement looked less like protection than testimony. Silas saw Clara's shoulders settle. Her breathing slowed. Then she finally looked directly at her son. "I said no." Preston's expression cracked. Only slightly, but enough. Silas understood then that the most frightening thing Preston faced that morning was not him. It was not the dogs. It was Clara making a decision without asking permission. A knock sounded behind Preston. He turned. Deputy Mara Venn stood on the porch. Beside her was a woman Silas had not met before. Miriam Cole was 56, medium height and sturdily built, with warm brown skin, short salt and pepper curls, and intelligent dark eyes behind rectangular glasses. She wore a navy winter coat over practical slacks and carried a leather document case rather than a badge. Miriam worked with Adult Protective Services for the county. She had spent almost 20 years dealing with cases where concern, money, dependence, and control had become tangled together. Unlike Mara, whose stillness felt investigative, Miriam's calm felt almost domestic. She spoke gently, listened completely, and had the unsettling ability to ask questions people could not easily escape by changing the subject. Mara introduced her. Preston's face cooled. "Adult Protective Services?" Miriam smiled politely. "Mr. Bellamy." "Why are you here?" "Because your parents are elderly adults who recently left a dependent living arrangement during a serious family conflict. I need to confirm their safety and wishes." "They are safe with me." "That is something I'll discuss with them." Preston folded his arms. "I'm their son." Miriam nodded. "I understand." The answer irritated him more than disagreement would have. Miriam asked to speak with Amos and Clara separately. Preston objected. Mara ended that immediately. "They can speak privately if they choose." Clara chose. Silas took North and Marlowe into the kitchen while Miriam sat with Clara near the fireplace. No one listened. That was important. Nearly 30 minutes later, Miriam spoke separately with Amos. She asked where they were, why they had left, what medication Clara took, what accounts they owned, whether either of them felt confused about time, location, finances, or family relationships. She did not ask Silas to interpret. She did not ask Preston. When she finished, Miriam closed her notebook. Both Mr. and Mrs. Bellamy understand where they are, the consequences of their choices, and what they want. Preston looked at her. "My mother has been ill." "Yes." "She's emotionally unstable." Clara flinched. Miriam's tone remained even. Being frightened, ill, or emotionally distressed does not automatically remove an adult's right to make decisions. Preston stared at her. So you're just going to leave them here? If they want to remain here temporarily, and Mr. Mercer agrees, yes. Silas said, they can stay. Preston's jaw tightened. There was another matter. Silas retrieved a clear evidence sleeve Mara had provided. Inside was the damaged section of Marlowe's collar and the identification tag recovered near Red Willow. He placed it on the table. Preston looked down. Silas kept his voice neutral. You said you took Marlowe to a pet care facility. Preston's eyes lifted toward Amos. I said I intended to. Amos shook his head. That isn't what you said. Mara stepped in before the exchange escalated. Mr. Bellamy, what happened to the dog after you left your property? Preston looked at the tag again. He got loose. Where? I don't remember exactly. Mara's expression did not change. You drove north that afternoon. Preston's eyes sharpened. You've been tracking me? We verified roadway information connected to a missing animal report. I'm not discussing this without an attorney. That's your right. Mara wrote something in her notebook. No argument, no accusation. That calmness seemed to unsettle Preston more than anger. Miriam then asked Amos about the financial arrangement. Amos explained that he had signed limited power of attorney documents when Clara underwent surgery. Preston had taken over bill payment. Later, Amos noticed transfers he did not fully understand. Some went into investment accounts connected to companies Preston controlled. Were those investments authorized? Miriam asked. I don't know. That is enough reason to review them. Preston laughed without humor. You're making this sound criminal. No, Miriam replied. I'm saying it requires review. She gave Amos and Clara information about freezing further discretionary transfers until documents could be examined by the proper office and an independent financial advisor. Silas stayed out of that discussion completely. This was not his investigation. That restraint cost him more than anyone in the room knew. Preston finally lost control when Clara said she wanted him to leave. Mom, you don't understand what these people are doing. Clara looked exhausted. I understand enough. You're letting strangers turn you against your own son. Amos stood. Preston. His son stepped toward Clara. Not violently, but too quickly. North immediately moved. One step. Silas's voice came low and precise. North, stay. The German shepherd stopped instantly. Not another inch. Preston stared at him, then at Silas. For the first time, the polished confidence was gone. Silas did not move closer, did not raise his voice, did not threaten him. You're allowed to be angry, Silas said. Preston's chest rose and fell. But you do not get to make their decisions anymore. Preston looked toward Amos. His father did not look away, then toward Clara. She had one hand resting on Marlowe's head. You're choosing this? Preston asked. Clara answered quietly. I'm choosing myself. The words seemed to reach somewhere no accusation could. Amos stepped beside her. So am I. Preston stood there for several long seconds. A successful man in an expensive coat. A son who had spent years solving every problem by taking control of it. And suddenly there was nothing left to control. He picked up the suitcase, left the medication, then walked toward the door. Before stepping outside, he turned back. No one chased him. No one argued. No one begged him to understand. That, more than anything, seemed to defeat him. The door closed. North remained still until Silas released him. Marlowe rested his head against Clara's knee, and in the quiet that followed, Amos reached for his wife's hand. For the first time in years, the word no had remained standing after Preston left the room. 3 weeks changed the shape of winter around Lake Mirabel. The snow remained deep along the northern shore, but the violence of Winter Crown had passed. Blue mornings returned to Aurora Vale. Sunlight spilled through the white pines, and long icicles beneath the cabin roof began dripping for an hour each afternoon before freezing again after sunset. Inside Silas Mercer's cabin, the emergency had ended. The uncertainty had not. The review of Amos and Clara Bellamy's finances moved slowly, as such things often did. Some transactions Preston had made were entirely legitimate. Insurance payments, medical expenses, household bills, repairs to the guest house where his parents had lived. Others were harder to explain. Miriam Cole had arranged for the Bellamys to speak with an independent elder law attorney and financial advisor. Until the documents were properly reviewed, Preston could no longer make discretionary decisions concerning accounts Amos and Clara had reclaimed control over. No dramatic arrest followed, no courtroom door slammed. There was simply paperwork, signatures, phone calls, passwords changed, copies of documents recovered. To Silas, that felt strangely appropriate. A life could be taken apart loudly. Putting one back together was usually quieter. Amos now kept a slim folder near his chair containing bank statements, identification papers, and new account information. Every evening he checked that folder before bed. Silas noticed. He never mentioned it. Clara was stronger too. She could walk around the cabin without help, though Naomi still insisted she avoid overexertion. Color had returned to her face, and she had begun complaining about Silas's coffee. That, Naomi claimed, was an excellent clinical sign. Marlowe continued recovering beside her. The 10-year-old German shepherd had gained some weight, and the rawness along his paw pads was healing. He still moved more slowly than North, but age had given him a certain dignity. North would race out toward the lake each morning, stop after 20 yards, look back, and wait. Marlowe would follow at his own pace. Silas sometimes watched them from the porch. He had started to understand that waiting could also be a form of loyalty. But one problem remained. Amos and Clara needed somewhere to live. Silas's cabin had never been built for 4 adults and 2 German shepherds. More importantly, Amos and Clara needed something that belonged to them. Not Silas, not Preston, them. One morning, Silas looked through the kitchen window toward the opposite shore of Lake Mirabel, and remembered a house. The cottage sat less than half a mile around the eastern edge of the lake. It had belonged to Silas's great-aunt Evelyn, his grandfather's younger sister, who had lived there until moving into assisted living many years earlier. After her death, the property passed through the family and eventually became Silas's responsibility along with the surrounding land. He had never sold it. He had also never done much with it. When Silas led Amos down the snow-packed path that afternoon, the older man stopped 20 feet from the building. The cottage was small, cedar-sided, and built beneath 3 enormous white pines. Its roof sagged near the rear chimney. The porch tilted slightly to the left. One shutter hung crooked. 2 front windows had swollen in their frames and refused to open. Amos stared. Silas waited. Amos finally said, "You call this a house?" Silas looked at the building. "Technically. The porch is leaning. Character. The roof needs work. Ventilation." Amos pointed toward one window. "That one looks permanently closed." "Security." Amos turned toward him. "You were this annoying in the Navy?" "Highly decorated for it." The old carpenter's mouth twitched. Silas handed him the key. "Use it as long as you need." The humor disappeared. Amos looked down at the key. "We can't take your house." "You're not taking it." "Then what are we doing?" Silas looked at the crooked porch. "I'm giving a retired carpenter a hobby." Amos laughed. A real laugh this time. It echoed across the frozen lake. Work began 3 days later. Caleb Rourke arrived first with lumber strapped to his truck and announced that any roof repaired by Silas alone would become an experimental Navy structure. Silas told him to climb the ladder. Caleb did. By lunchtime, half of Aurora Vale seemed to know about the cottage. That was mostly because of June Holloway. June arrived in an aging blue Subaru carrying 3 cardboard boxes and enough opinions to renovate the entire county. At 67, she was a short, pleasantly round woman with a lively face, rosy fair skin, bright green eyes, and short silver curls that refused to stay beneath her knitted cranberry hat. She wore a thick cranberry cardigan beneath her winter coat and moved with the energy of someone who had spent 4 decades running Bluebird Bakery, where she knew nearly every resident's birthday, divorce, favorite pie, and business, whether they wanted her to or not. June had been Clara's friend years earlier, when Clara still taught piano in Aurora Vale. Time and distance had weakened the friendship. They had never quite destroyed it. June climbed the porch steps, saw Clara through the doorway, and stopped. For once, she had nothing to say. Clara stared back. Then June opened both arms. "You look terrible." Clara laughed so suddenly that she had to cover her mouth. "You haven't improved." They embraced. Both women cried. Then June wiped her eyes and immediately returned to being June. She placed the boxes on the kitchen counter. 3 dozen cinnamon rolls. Caleb looked down from the roof. "Marry me." "No, you use too much frosting." June surveyed the construction. Every building project needs a supervisor who knows absolutely nothing about construction. Clara adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. "Congratulations, you've been promoted." June pointed at her. "There she is." Re-hook. Later that afternoon, while the others worked, Clara found an old upright piano beneath a canvas sheet in the cottage's rear room. 3 keys did not sound. Several were badly out of tune. Dust covered the dark wood. Clara stood before it for a long time. Silas was passing the doorway when he saw her lift the cover. Her fingers hovered above the keys. Then she pressed a single note, thin, imperfect, but alive. Marlowe, sleeping in a patch of sunlight outside the room, raised his head. North came in from the porch. Without being called, both German shepherds settled near the doorway. Clara pressed another key, then another. A hesitant fragment of melody appeared. June stopped talking in the kitchen. Amos lowered the hammer in his hand. No one entered the room. They simply listened. Silas watched Clara's shoulders slowly straighten. The cottage was not finished. Yet somehow, with 3 broken piano keys and 2 dogs lying in the doorway, it sounded occupied for the first time in years. The following days found their rhythm. Caleb repaired shingles and flashing. Silas replaced the aging furnace and rebuilt sections of the heating system. Amos attacked the cottage with the offended determination of a craftsman who considered crooked wood a personal insult. His arthritis prevented heavy work, so Silas did the lifting. Amos measured, marked, directed, and criticized Silas's carpentry. "You're off an eighth." "No one can see an eighth." "I can." "That sounds like your problem." "It becomes yours when I make you redo it." Silas redid it. North usually slept on the porch. Marlowe chose the warmest patch of sun beside him. Within a week, people driving around Lake Mirabel had grown accustomed to seeing the 2 German shepherds there. North alert and upright, Marlowe gray-muzzled and content, both watching the human beings perform unnecessary amounts of work. One afternoon, Silas and Amos were replacing damaged porch boards. The others had gone into town. For several minutes they worked without speaking. Then Amos said, "I should have stopped Preston earlier." Silas kept driving a screw into the board. Amos continued, "I saw what he was doing, not at first, but eventually." The drill stopped. "I kept telling myself he was stressed, that Clara needed stability, that families forgive things." Amos stared across the frozen lake. "Truth is, I was afraid that if I pushed too hard, we'd lose our son." His mouth tightened. "So I let Clara lose pieces of herself instead." Silas sat back on his heels. Amos looked ashamed. Silas understood shame well enough not to insult it with easy comfort. After a while, Amos asked, "Why do you live out here? You've seen the taxes in town?" Amos looked at him. Silas sighed. There were questions a man could dodge only until he respected the person asking them. His name was Owen Maddox. Amos waited. Silas looked toward the lake. "Owen was my closest friend in the teams." The words came slowly. Silas told him about a mission overseas, a rescue, a sequence of decisions made in seconds. Owen never came home. Officially, Silas had done nothing wrong. That had never helped. "I spent years thinking if I had moved faster, chosen another route, noticed one more thing." He rubbed his thumb over an old scar near his wrist. "I stopped letting people depend on me." Amos studied him. "Because?" Silas gave a dry laugh. "You're a carpenter. Figure it out." "Because you thought if nobody needed you, nobody could die because you failed them." Silas said nothing. Amos did not tell him it was not his fault. He did not tell him Owen would want him to move on. Instead, he asked, "What was Owen like?" Silas turned. The question struck him harder than sympathy would have. "What?" You always talk about how he died?" Silas realized he did. Amos waited. Slowly, Silas smiled. "He was terrible at cards." Amos leaned back. "How terrible?" "Suspiciously terrible. We thought he was cheating backward." Amos laughed. Silas continued. "Owen loved bad country music. He called everyone on their birthdays even when deployed. He once spent 6 hours repairing a radio he could have replaced in 10 minutes because he hated throwing useful things away." Stories came one after another. Small ones, ridiculous ones, living ones. The sky began turning gold above Lake Mirabel. Silas kept talking. For years, Owen had existed in his mind at the worst moment of his life. That afternoon, on the half-repaired porch of an old cottage, Silas remembered something almost forgotten. Before Owen Maddox had become a man who died, he had been a man who lived. North wandered over and rested beside Silas's boot. Across the yard, Marlowe slept beneath the fading winter sun. Amos picked up another porch board. "Sounds like I would have liked him." Silas looked over the lake. "Yeah." His voice softened. "You would have." And for once, the memory did not end with the moment Silas lost his friend. Winter did not leave Lake Mirabel all at once. It loosened its grip slowly. First came the sound of water moving beneath the ice. Then darker lines appeared along the shoreline, where afternoon sunlight softened the frozen edges. Snow slipped from the cedar roofs in heavy sheets. The white pines began shedding their burden branch by branch, and narrow paths of brown earth returned beneath the trees. By early April, Aurora Vale smelled of wet bark, cold water, and thawing soil. Across the lake from Silas Mercer's cabin, the old cottage no longer looked abandoned. The porch stood straight. Fresh shingles covered the repaired roof. The stubborn windows opened again. A thin ribbon of smoke curled from the chimney each morning. And above the front steps hung a small wooden sign Amos Bellamy had carved by hand. Bellamy Cottage. Nothing decorative beneath it. Nothing sentimental. Amos claimed a house did not need a speech hanging over the door. At 78, he had regained enough strength to turn the rear utility room into a modest woodworking corner. His shoulders remained slightly stooped, and arthritis still punished him on cold mornings, but his large carpenter's hands had rediscovered their purpose. He no longer attempted heavy furniture. Instead, he made things that required patience more than muscle. Small oak stools, music boxes, wooden foxes and bears for children, birdhouses shaped like little Minnesota cabins. June Holloway displayed several pieces beside the register at Bluebird Bakery. The first stool sold within an hour. Amos accused June of buying it herself. June swore innocence with such theatrical outrage that everyone immediately assumed she had. Clara Bellamy changed in quieter ways. Her heart condition had not disappeared. Neither had the weakness that followed her illness. But she had stopped behaving as though needing assistance required an apology. If Amos carried a grocery bag, she thanked him once. If June drove her into town, Clara did not spend the entire trip promising to repay the gasoline. And one afternoon each week, the restored upright piano in Bellamy Cottage became the center of a small music lesson. Children from Aurora Vale came in pairs or threes. Clara taught scales, rhythm, and patience. She also taught them that missing one note did not mean a song was ruined. Silas sometimes heard the lessons from across the lake when the wind was right. He never admitted that he listened. North always did. Marlowe preferred the porch. The older German shepherd had regained much of the weight he had lost, though gray around his muzzle made his age impossible to hide. His black saddle had dulled slightly against the warmer yellow of his coat, and his gait remained slower than North's. But he was comfortable. That seemed more important. North had developed the habit of sprinting ahead on their morning walks, then stopping near the bend in the lakeside trail and looking back. Marlowe would arrive several moments later. Only then would North continue. Silas had stopped calling him impatient. Apparently even impatience could learn manners. Silas's own life had changed so gradually that he noticed it mostly through inconvenience. There were more boots near his door, more coffee cups in his sink. People had begun expecting him to answer the radio. Caleb Rourke was largely responsible. One bright Saturday morning, Silas found himself loading first aid equipment into Aurora Vale Volunteer Rescue's utility truck. Caleb leaned against the tailgate, grinning. "You realize what this means?" Silas did not look up. "That you're avoiding work again?" "We finally recruited you." "I said I'd help occasionally." Caleb nodded solemnly. "Of course. Occasionally. Absolutely." Silas shut the equipment compartment. Caleb counted on his fingers. Only took one historic storm, 2 senior citizens, 2 German shepherds, and roughly 5 years of me asking. Silas looked at him. Terrible recruitment strategy. Still worked. Silas tried not to smile. He failed. He had not joined full-time. He did not need another uniform or another identity built around being responsible for everyone. But he had begun taking selected rescue calls. A stranded snowmobiler, a lost hiker, a flooded basement when the spring melt came too quickly. Small things, ordinary things. No medals, no gunfire, no men waiting for extraction under impossible circumstances. And strangely, that made helping easier. Silas was beginning to understand that being useful did not always require being heroic. Sometimes it only required showing up. Preston Bellamy remained part of the story too, just not in the way he once had been. The Financial Review had not transformed him overnight into either a criminal or a redeemed son. Some of his management of his parents' money had been proper. Some decisions had clearly exceeded what Amos believed he had authorized. Those matters remained with attorneys and financial professionals. Preston complied with the restrictions placed around the disputed accounts. Then, several weeks after leaving Lake Mirabel, he sent a letter. Not an email, not a text, a handwritten letter. Amos left it unopened on the kitchen table for 2 days. Clara finally sat beside him. "Are you going to read it?" "Eventually." "That sounds like a man hoping eventually becomes never." Amos looked at her. "You want to?" Clara considered it. "No." There was no fear in the answer. That mattered. They eventually opened it together. Preston apologized. Not perfectly. There were explanations buried inside the apology. Stress, responsibility, fear about Clara's health, the belief that he had been protecting them. But there were also sentences that did not excuse anything. He admitted he had stopped listening. He admitted he had treated decisions as problems to solve rather than choices belonging to his parents. And he asked whether, someday, they might agree to see him. Amos folded the letter. Clara looked out toward the lake. "What do you think?" "I think he wants an answer." "That wasn't what I asked." Amos smiled faintly. "I know." They were not ready, so they did not answer yet. For years, Preston's urgency had determined the pace of their lives. Now even forgiveness, if it ever came, would move at theirs. Rehook. That evening, Silas came over to return a woodworking clamp Amos had left in his truck. He found Clara sitting alone on the porch with Marlowe. The unopened envelope Preston had included for a reply rested beside her. Silas started to leave. Clara stopped him. "Do you think people can become different?" Silas leaned against the porch rail. "Sometimes." "That sounded painfully optimistic for you." "I'm trying new things." Clara smiled. Then she looked at Marlowe. The old dog was asleep with his gray muzzle resting across one paw. "I spent months thinking healing meant getting back everything that was taken." She touched the envelope. "But maybe sometimes healing is realizing you don't have to decide today what tomorrow should look like." Silas said nothing. Marlowe opened his eyes. He lifted his head, looked briefly at Clara, then toward the trail where North was approaching from across the yard. Marlowe did not rise. North came to him instead. The younger dog lay down beside the older one. 2 different animals, 2 different speeds, neither forcing the other to move. Clara watched them. So perhaps even dogs understand boundaries better than families. Silas gave a quiet laugh. "That seems unfair to dogs." For the first time, Preston's letter no longer looked like a threat lying on the porch. It was simply a choice waiting for another day. Spring strengthened. The ice withdrew farther from shore. Water began flashing blue between broken plates of white. One evening in late April, Amos called Silas shortly after dinner. "Come outside." "Why?" "Just come outside." Silas stepped onto his porch. Across the lake, Amos stood outside Bellamy Cottage pointing upward. The northern lights had appeared. Not the strongest Silas had ever seen, but beautiful. Green bands stretched above the black pines, faint at first, then brightening until they seemed to breathe across the stars. Silas walked around the lakeside trail with North. By the time he reached the cottage, Clara and Amos were sitting beneath blankets on the porch. Marlowe lay beside Clara's boots. North settled near Silas. No one spoke for several minutes. Then Clara said, "Do you ever wonder if North knew?" Silas glanced at her. Knew what? That something was coming. Silas understood. He smiled. "He's a dog, Clara." "That is not an answer." Amos chuckled. Silas looked down at North. The German shepherd's amber eyes reflected a thin green shimmer from the sky. Silas did not believe North predicted destiny. He believed in hearing, scent, training, instinct. 1,000 small pieces of information animals noticed before human beings did. But certainty no longer seemed necessary. Clara rested one hand on Marlowe's head. "People like to imagine we're the ones who rescue animals." She looked toward North. "Sometimes I wonder whether they're simply more patient about finding us." Silas looked across Lake Mirabel. For a moment, Owen Maddox entered his thoughts, but Owen did not appear as a final radio call, or a mission report, or the worst minute Silas could remember. He remembered Owen singing badly in a transport plane, Owen repairing a broken radio nobody wanted, Owen laughing with his boots on a table while someone complained about regulations. Silas felt the old grief. It was still grief, but it no longer felt like a locked door. Living had once seemed disloyal, as if every new friendship pushed Owen farther into the past. Silas finally understood the opposite. A person could carry the dead forward by carrying what had been good about them. Loyalty did not require standing forever beside the place where someone was lost. Sometimes loyalty meant walking. The next morning came bright and cold. North and Marlowe followed the lakeside path. North moved ahead with the easy strength of a younger dog. Marlowe followed steadily. Silas walked behind them with Amos and Clara. None of them discussed how unlikely the whole thing had been. A storm, a road, a cabin, a missing dog, a series of choices that could easily have gone another way. No one needed to call it fate. No one needed to call it a miracle. Perhaps destiny was simply the name people gave to a moment after they finally understood what it had changed. North reached the bend. As always, he stopped. He looked back. Marlowe was still coming. So were the people. North waited. Silas watched him and smiled. The dog had never carried them all. He had never solved their lives. He had only noticed what mattered and refused to ignore it. The rest had belonged to them. To Amos choosing to leave, to Clara choosing to speak, to Silas choosing to open his life instead of merely his door. And perhaps that was all Grace ever asked of anyone, not to know the whole road, only to recognize when something worth following had appeared. Marlowe finally reached North. The two German shepherds moved forward together. Silas followed. This time, he did not feel as though he were walking away from the life he had lost. He was simply walking toward the one that remained. Sometimes the greatest miracles do not arrive with thunder, bright signs, or answers we can immediately understand. Sometimes they come quietly. They come as a stranger opening a door in the middle of a storm, as an old dog finding his way back to the person who never stopped loving him, as a wounded man choosing, after years of isolation, to let other people depend on him again. And sometimes they come through an animal that simply refuses to walk away. Silas believed he had opened his cabin to save Amos and Clara from the cold. But in the weeks that followed, he discovered that kindness rarely travels in only one direction. While he helped them find safety, dignity, and Marlowe, they helped him find something he had buried for years, the courage to live without believing that every loss was his fault to carry forever. North never spoke a word. He did not need to. He noticed fear before anyone explained it. He searched when others were losing hope. He waited for an older dog who could no longer walk as quickly, and through those simple acts of loyalty, he reminded everyone around him of something human beings often forget. Love does not always fix everything. Sometimes love simply stays. Perhaps that is one of the quiet ways God works in our lives. Not always by removing the storm, but by placing someone beside us while we walk through it. not always by giving back everything we have lost, but by showing us that something good can still grow in the empty places. A person we meet unexpectedly, a neighbor who checks on us, a friend who listens without trying to solve us, a dog who rests beside us when words are useless. What looks like coincidence today may one day become the moment we realize our path changed, and maybe that is the lesson of Lake Mirabel. Amos and Clara learned that growing older did not mean surrendering their voice. Silas learned that remembering someone he lost did not require him to stop loving the people still here. And Marlowe and North showed them that loyalty is not about holding someone back. Sometimes loyalty means waiting patiently until they are ready to keep walking. There may be someone in your own life carrying a burden you cannot see, an elderly parent who feels forgotten, a veteran who has become quieter than he used to be, a friend who keeps saying everything is fine, a neighbor who has been alone too long, or perhaps even an animal waiting at a shelter, on a porch, or beside an empty chair for someone to notice that it still has love left to give. You may never know how much one small act of kindness can change another person's story. A phone call, a meal, a ride home, a few minutes of listening, an open door. Do not underestimate the ordinary ways God may use you to become part of someone else's miracle. And if you are the one walking through the storm right now, remember this: a difficult season is not the whole story. Winter can remain for a long time, but it does not remain forever. Sometimes the first sign of spring is very small, a little more light, a hand reaching toward you, a loyal dog waiting at the bend in the road. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who may need a little hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from, or share a moment when a person or an animal came into your life at exactly the right time. And if you believe the world still needs stories about faith, compassion, loyalty, courage, and second chances, subscribe to the channel and join us for the next journey. May God bless you and the people you love. May He protect your family, give strength to those carrying silent burdens, bring comfort to those who are grieving, and place faithful hearts beside anyone who feels alone. May He guide your steps through every season ahead. And when the road becomes difficult, may you always find the courage to keep walking. God bless you, and we'll see you in the next story.